Be Me Nate, 29, freelancer, work from home, design and content stuff. Mostly logo work, brand assets, social media graphics, whatever clients throw at me. The kind of job where you can technically go 3 days without leaving the apartment and not notice until you run out of food. I'd been doing it for about 2 years at that point. First year was great. Second year, I started noticing my back hurt pretty much constantly, and I was getting this weird low-grade restlessness in the evenings. Not unhappy exactly, just kind of stuck in a loop of desk, couch, desk, couch. I needed to do something physical before my body just decided to stop working properly. I'd been putting it off for a while the way you put off things that require you to sign up and commit to showing up somewhere. You tell yourself you'll start next week, and then next week becomes 2 months later. A friend of mine, Jared, had been going to this yoga place for a few months. Jared is the kind of guy who tries things without making a big deal about it. He's not evangelical about stuff, doesn't push it on you. He just mentioned once that his back had been better since he started going and that the place was decent. Said the instructor was good, said the morning classes weren't packed, said parking wasn't a nightmare. I wasn't really a yoga person. I had this vague idea that yoga was either for very calm people or very flexible people, and I was neither of those things. But my alternatives were running, which I genuinely hate, or joining a big box gym, which felt like more commitment than I wanted. So I signed up for a trial week at the studio and just kind of kept going after that. The first session was uncomfortable in the way that things are when you realize how much your body has quietly deteriorated while you weren't paying attention. The second session was a little better. By the end of the trial week, I'd already mentally factored it into my schedule. The studio is nothing special from the outside. A regular converted ground floor space in a neighborhood that has 3 coffee shops and a hardware store and not much else. Wooden floors, some plants along the windowsill, that kind of ambient music that has no lyrics and doesn't really go anywhere. The changing area is a curtained corner at the back. The bathroom has a handwritten sign on the door about the lock being temperamental and needing to be lifted before you turn it. It felt like a real place that had been put together by people who used it, rather than designed by someone who wanted it to look a certain way. I like that about it. There's a difference between a space that's been styled and a space that's been lived in. The instructor for the morning classes was Sloan. She ran Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings, probably 27, 28, somewhere around there. Good at her job in a way that was immediately obvious the first session. She had a kind of easy authority about it, not performative, just clearly knew what she was doing and communicated it well. She'd correct your form without making you feel like an idiot about it. She'd remember that one regular had a bad knee and another had some shoulder thing, and she'd adjust the instructions for them mid-class without breaking the flow of the session. After the second session, she knew my name without me reminding her. That sounds like a small thing, but most people in that situation don't actually bother. They learn 5 names, and everyone else is just, "Hey, you." The class was maybe 60% women and the rest men. There were about 6 or 7 guys who showed up consistently. Tyler was one of them, mid-30s maybe, worked in something finance-related based on the conversations I overheard. Always had a coffee from the place down the street when he arrived, always had something to say. A couple of other guys I knew by face and first name, but not much more. One worked in construction. One I genuinely had no idea. He just showed up and did his thing. And me and Jared. After class, there was always this natural little window where people hung around near the entrance, rolling up mats, getting shoes back on. Someone would say something about how a particular pose went, or about the weather, or whatever else came up. Sloan was usually part of it, just relaxed, not rushed, laughing at something someone said, not working the room in a professional sense, just present in the way some people are naturally good at being. It was the kind of low-stakes social time that's actually pretty rare. Nobody was there for networking, Nobody had an agenda. It was just people who'd done the same thing for an hour, winding down together. I started looking forward to those 10 or 15 minutes almost as much as the class itself. Not in any dramatic way. It was just a nice start to the day before going home to sit in front of a screen for 6 or 7 hours. Jared and I had a habit of grabbing coffee after the Wednesday class, a place about 2 blocks away, nothing fancy. We'd talk about work or whatever was going on, sometimes about the class or people from it. Sloane came up occasionally in conversation the way people you see regularly come up. Not as a main topic, just mentioned in passing. Jared had said at some point early on that she seemed like someone worth getting to know. I agreed with that, but I wasn't trying to rush it or engineer it. I couldn't tell yet if she was actually friendly with me specifically, or just friendly the way good instructors are, with everyone who shows up and keeps showing up. Sometimes those are the same thing and sometimes they're not. I figured I'd let it develop naturally if it was going to develop at all. No pressure, no timeline, no big plan. This went on for maybe 2 months. The classes, the after-class hangouts, the Wednesday coffee with Jared. It was a good routine. My back was genuinely better. I was sleeping better. I was leaving the apartment more consistently. It was working on every level it needed to work on. Then, one evening, Jared texted me. Just a link. No explanation before it, no comment after. I clicked it on my phone while I was eating dinner. It was a post Sloane had made on whatever platform she used for her wellness content. I hadn't known she had one, and I'd never looked. The post had a lot of engagement, a lot of likes, a lot of comments. It was about how men should approach her. I'm going to try to describe it accurately without overstating it. It wasn't unhinged or aggressive or written from a place of obvious anger. It was calm, clearly written, the kind of thing someone posts when they feel like they have something considered and important to say. She started with a brief intro about her boundaries and personal space being important to her well-being. Then came the list. Don't compliment her appearance unless she's explicitly invited that. Don't approach her after class because she needs time to decompress and process the session. If you want to have a genuine connection with her, you need to bring what she called intentional, conscious energy. She said she could sense when someone's attention wasn't coming from a real and grounded place. She said her personal space and the terms of her interactions weren't up for negotiation. She said something about how men's sense of entitlement to women's attention was something she refused to engage with. The last part was about how her attention wasn't a reward, and men needed to stop treating it like one. I read through it twice, not because it was confusing. It was pretty clear, just to make sure I was reading it correctly. Then I put my phone on the table and sat with it for a minute. Jared texted again a few minutes later, asked what I thought. I told him I thought she was going to get exactly what she asked for. He sent back a laughing emoji and then went quiet for the rest of the evening. I finished dinner and didn't really think about it again that night. I want to explain where I was coming from because I think it actually matters for understanding what happened next. I didn't read that post and feel angry about it. I wasn't insulted. I wasn't wounded. I wasn't plotting anything. The reaction I had was genuinely more like reading a sign on a door. The sign says closed. You don't get angry at the sign. You just register it and adjust. She'd published a clear set of instructions for how to interact with her. One of those instructions was don't approach her after class. Another was about not offering compliments on her appearance. The overall message was, be careful, be intentional, think about whether what you're doing is what I want rather than what you want. Okay. Noted. The obvious response was to adjust my behavior accordingly. I thought that was the entire point she was making. I thought that's what she was asking for. Next class I came in, set up my mat, did the session. Sloane was the same as she always was. Professional, good at her job, nothing weird about her energy in the class itself. At the end, I rolled up my mat, got my shoes on, caught her eye on the way to the door. She said, "See you Wednesday." I said, "Yeah, see you then," and I left. Didn't stop near the entrance, didn't hang around, just went out the door. Not in a pointed way, not to make a statement, just because the instructions said not to approach her after class. I noticed Tyler doing the same thing. Tyler had always been one of the more naturally chatty ones during those post-class minutes. Always had something to say, always seemed to get a laugh out of Sloane. That day he packed his mat into his bag, put his shoes on, and walked straight out. No goodbyes, no conversation, just gone. Not rude about it, not dramatic, just efficient. The construction guy did the same thing. So did one of the other regulars. Not all at once. The adjustment happened across the next session or two, each of them quietly recalibrating their behavior. Nobody talked about it. We didn't have a group chat or a meeting about it. We'd all just read the same post and independently arrived at the same conclusion. I found that interesting to think about afterward. She'd written something aimed at a specific type of behavior, and every guy in the room had applied it to his own behavior and made the same adjustment. Which tells you something about the room that I don't think she'd intended to learn. The class itself didn't change in any way that mattered. Sloane was still a good instructor, still ran a tight session, still corrected form and remembered individual limitations. But that window after class changed. It got quiet. The women who took the class still talked to her, still gathered near the entrance the way they always had. Her friend, who was also a regular, was always there. But the loose circle of guys who used to be part of the post-class wind-down just weren't anymore. We were leaving. I'd be halfway down the block some mornings before I'd fully registered that I'd walked out without stopping. I wasn't doing it as a protest. I wasn't coordinating with anyone. I wasn't keeping score. It just seemed like the correct response to the information I had. And at first, I didn't even think much about whether she'd notice it or what the cumulative effect would be. I was just doing what the instructions said. A few days after that, I was working from home and had one of those slow afternoons where the creative part of your brain just stops cooperating. You know, when you stare at a screen and nothing comes, and you realize forcing it is only going to make it worse. I went for a walk, got a coffee, sat outside for a bit. I was thinking about the post, not obsessively, just the way things sit at the edge of your attention when they haven't fully processed yet. The thing that kept coming back to me was the gap between the problem she was describing and the solution she chose. The problem was a small number of guys who weren't reading her disinterest correctly and kept pushing anyway. The solution was a public post that everyone read, including people who had never been the problem. I tried to think about it from her side. I get that you can't exactly write a targeted message to specific individuals without it becoming awkward and confrontational in a different way. Posting publicly is how you address something publicly. That part makes sense. But then the question is, what do you expect to happen? Did she think the guys who were the actual problem would read it and recognize themselves and change? Or did she think the post would just establish that she had standards, and that would be enough? I genuinely didn't know the answer to that. From where I was sitting, it seemed like the most likely outcome was that the guys with no self-awareness would scroll past it, and the guys with too much self-awareness would overcorrect out of caution, which is roughly what happened. But I might have been reading the whole thing wrong from the start. I wasn't inside her head. I was just someone who'd read a post and made a decision based on what it said. About a week and a half in, maybe 2 weeks, I started noticing Sloane was doing something different before class. She was making more rounds of the room while people were setting up their mats, asking people how they were, whether they had anything specific they wanted to work on that day, how a thing from the previous session had felt. Before, she'd always been warm, but she wasn't usually doing a lap of the whole room before every class. It was subtle, not weird, just a change in the pattern. She also announced at the end of one session that she was thinking about starting something optional after the Friday class. A community circle was what she called it. Totally voluntary, no pressure, just for anyone who wanted to spend a bit more time connecting with the group after the practice. The phrase she used was building authentic community around the practice. She said she'd been thinking a lot about what community means in a wellness context and how often people show up to a class and leave without really connecting. I didn't say anything during this, just nodded and finished rolling up my mat. I didn't go to the first one. Jared did, out of curiosity mostly. We got coffee the following Wednesday, and he told me how it went. He said it was Sloan, 2 women from the regular class, and one guy who had very clearly arrived with one of the women and wasn't there on his own initiative. They sat in a rough circle, and Sloan talked about breathwork and seasonal rhythms and creating space for genuine connection. She asked people to share one thing they were holding on to and one thing they were ready to release. Jared said he passed on sharing and just listened. Said the whole thing lasted about 20 minutes and had the energy of something that had been set up for a larger group that didn't quite materialize. I said that was a pretty good way to describe it. He said he didn't regret going because now he knew. I said, yeah, that's fair. I kept going to the regular classes. The yoga was still working for me. My back was still better. The routine still made the rest of my week function better. I just wasn't doing the after-class window anymore. It wasn't a grudge thing. It wasn't a conscious decision I was remaking every time I walked out. It had just become the new pattern. Show up, do the class, leave. Clean and simple. At some point, she posted something new. I didn't find it myself. Someone else in a group chat I'm in screenshotted it and shared it. The post title was something like, "Why are men so emotionally unavailable these days?" It was longer than the first one, more reflective in tone. She talked about noticing that the men in her life had become more closed off, less present, less willing to engage genuinely. She said she'd been sitting with this observation for a while and trying to understand where it was coming from. She had a section about how men are socialized to perform strength rather than actually feel things, how this creates a kind of defensive unavailability that looks like toughness from the outside but is actually just fear. She used the phrase emotional armor and talked about how toxic masculinity teaches men that connection is a weakness. She ended with something about hoping that more men would find the courage to show up in an unguarded way and allow themselves to be truly seen. The comments were what you'd expect. Mostly women agreeing with her. Yes, this is so real. Yes, men need to do the work. Yes, I see this everywhere. There was one comment from a guy somewhere in the middle of the thread. I only know what it said because Jared had screenshotted the thread before it got deleted. The guy had written something like, "Maybe they read your last post." 5 words. Just that. It was gone by the time I looked for it. I'm not going to say that comment was wrong because it wasn't, but I also understand why you delete something like that. It's a lot easier to remove a comment than to actually engage with what it's pointing at, especially in public, especially when the comment cuts close to something you're not ready to look at directly. Jared brought all of this up over coffee after the next Wednesday session. Said the thing he kept coming back to was that her original post wasn't unreasonable in isolation. Like, taken on its own terms. Nobody is owed access to someone else. Nobody has to accept attention they didn't ask for. Those things are true. But he said there was a gap between what she thought she was doing and what actually happened. What she thought she was doing was filtering, creating a finer mesh that would catch the bad actors while letting through the people who were genuinely there for the right reasons. What actually happened was she just cleared the room. I said, yeah, the problem is the rules can't distinguish. The post couldn't tell the difference between the guy who was pushing too hard and the guy who was just being friendly and maybe a little interested. The rules applied equally to both. So both groups made the same adjustment. The guys who had actually been making her uncomfortable either shrugged and fell back or found somewhere else to direct their attention. The guys who were just being normal shrugged and fell back because they didn't want to accidentally become the guy making her uncomfortable. And what you're left with is a space where everyone is professionally courteous and nothing else. Jared said she basically implemented a blanket policy that didn't account for differentiation. I said that's more or less it. He said the really interesting part was what came after. That she then posted about why men had become so distant and unavailable, and listed a bunch of cultural and psychological reasons for it, without appearing to connect it to the thing she'd written 2 weeks earlier. Or, if she connected it wrong. Found the explanation somewhere in culture or upbringing, instead of looking at the more obvious and recent cause. I said I didn't know whether she'd made the connection or not. I said maybe she had, and it was just uncomfortable to sit with publicly. Jared nodded and said fair enough. Then he said the deleted comment was doing more actual work than anything else in that whole thread. I said yeah. We finished coffee, and he had something to get to. I walked home and got back to my work. It wasn't something I was spending a lot of mental energy on. It was just a thing that had happened and was still happening in the background. Another week or so went by. The same pattern continued. Class, roll up mat, leave. Sloan continued doing the pre-class rounds, and the Friday circle kept running with approximately the same small attendance. I went to one of the Friday circles eventually, not because I'd decided anything, just because I had a free morning and nothing waiting for me at home. It was Sloan, 3 women, Tyler, and me. Tyler seemed slightly surprised to see me there. I was slightly surprised to see him there too. We did the breathing thing, and Sloan asked some open questions about what people were finding meaningful in their practice lately. It was okay. Nothing that changed my life, but not uncomfortable either. Afterward, Tyler and I walked out at the same time. We hadn't talked in a while. He said something like, "So you finally came?" I said yeah. Figured I'd see what it was. He said it was better when more people showed up. I said yeah, probably. And we went our separate ways. That was around the time I started noticing the after-class window had started loosening up slightly again. Not back to what it had been, not the same easy group energy as before, but not a silent professional void either. A few people staying a few minutes, a bit of conversation, nothing organized. I stayed a couple of times when I didn't have anywhere pressing to be. Then came the Friday session where Sloan came over while I was rolling up my mat. She asked if I had a few minutes. I said sure. She asked how I was doing, how work was going. I told her fine, decent week. Had a client who kept changing the brief, but it had mostly sorted itself out. She laughed at that and said that sounded familiar, even in a completely different field. Then she said she'd noticed I'd seemed a bit different lately. A bit more distant, she said. Less present somehow. She said she just wanted to check in and make sure I was comfortable in the space. I told her I was fine. Class was great. I wasn't planning on going anywhere. Everything was good on my end. She nodded at that, but didn't move toward the door or start wrapping up the conversation. Then she said she'd been noticing that some of the guys in the group had kind of pulled back over the last few weeks, that the energy after class felt different to her. She said she wasn't sure if something had happened, or if there was something she could be doing differently as an instructor. She looked genuinely confused, rather than accusatory. Not setting anything up, not performing concern, just actually not understanding what had shifted. I looked at her for a moment. The easy move was to just say, I don't know. Things have just been busy, and leave. That would have ended the conversation cleanly, and everyone could go home. But she was standing there, asking a real question in a real way. Not a trap, not a test, just a person who wanted to understand something that she didn't understand. So I answered her. I said, "You posted something a few weeks ago about how men should interact with you. You said don't approach after class. Don't offer unsolicited compliments. Make sure your energy is intentional. I said we read it and we respected it. That's the whole answer. No conspiracy, no coordinated response, no agenda. The instructions were clear, we followed them. She said that's not what she meant by it. I asked what she meant then. She took a moment before answering. Said she'd been dealing with a few specific guys who were making her uncomfortable, who kept trying things after she'd made it obvious she wasn't interested, who seemed to treat her attention like it was something they were owed. She said she'd written the post out of frustration with those specific situations. She was trying to address that specific problem. I said I understood that, said that made complete sense as something you'd want to address, but then I said I didn't know where the line was. Looking at the post, I couldn't tell whether what I'd been doing before was on the wrong side of it or not. And since the post seemed to be saying that getting it wrong meant I was part of the problem, the safer choice was to take everything back to baseline. Be professional, be polite, do the class, leave. She couldn't really argue with that interpretation because it was the logical reading of what she'd written. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she hadn't really thought about how it would land for someone who wasn't doing anything wrong. Said she'd been thinking about the guys who were the problem, and she hadn't considered how everyone else would read the same post, that they'd have no way of knowing they weren't the ones she was talking about. I said I wasn't trying to make a point or score anything. I was just answering the question she'd asked. She said she appreciated the honest answer. Said it actually helped her understand what had happened. I said, okay, see you Monday. She said, yeah, see you Monday. And I left. I told Jared about it later. He asked what she said when I explained it. I said she was quiet for a moment, and then said she hadn't thought about it from that angle. He said that's honestly a pretty mature response. Said a lot of people in that exact situation would have gotten defensive, or found a way to make it about men always having to make everything about themselves. I said, yeah, she didn't do that. She just sat with it. He said, so what happens now? I said, I don't know. Probably things slowly go back to something resembling normal. He said that seems like the best outcome, all things considered. I said, yeah, probably. A few weeks after that, the original post disappeared. I didn't notice it myself. Jared texted me about it. Just, that post is gone. I checked, and he was right. No explanation attached, no follow-up addressing it, no acknowledgement, just quietly removed, like it had never been there. She started posting different content after that. I caught a few of them because Jared would sometimes send screenshots, or I'd see something shared in a different context. The tone had shifted noticeably, less instructional, less about drawing lines and defining terms, more open, more about building something rather than protecting something. A lot of it was about real connection and what it requires from everyone involved. One post was specifically about the difference between having standards and building walls. She talked about how it's easy to confuse the two and how one comes from a place of knowing what you want, while the other comes from a place of fear. She didn't reference any specific situation, didn't explain the context, but the timing was the timing. I'm not going to claim I know what was going on in her head through any of this. I don't know if our conversation was the thing that shifted something for her, or whether it was just one input among many. I don't know if she had some clear moment of realization, or whether it was more gradual. I don't really need to know. She's not a character in a story I'm trying to explain. She's a real person doing her thing. People change their minds for all kinds of reasons, and usually it's not one single clean cause. What I know concretely is that the class kept being good. Sloan was still a solid instructor, still ran the session well, still remembered your form corrections and your physical limitations and your name. The after-class energy kept loosening up over the following weeks. Not dramatically, not announced, just gradually becoming more relaxed again. Tyler started staying for a few minutes more regularly. I did too when I had time. The Friday circle continued, and attendance was a bit better some weeks, same as before other weeks. One morning, Sloan asked how a project I'd mentioned weeks earlier had ended up going. It was a thing with a client that had been annoying. I'd mentioned it in passing during one of the pre-class conversations. I'd almost forgotten I'd brought it up. I told her it worked out fine. The client had been difficult about it, but in the end, they were happy with the result. She said, "That's great. Glad it came together." We talked for maybe 3 or 4 minutes about the general experience of working with clients who don't know what they want until they see it. She had her own version of that from the wellness side, people who come in saying they want relaxation, but then push back against the slower pace. I said, "Yeah, that's exactly it." Then I said I should head out. She said, "Yeah, have a good one." And I left. Normal. Completely normal. The kind of conversation you have with someone you see regularly and get along with. Nothing remarkable about it, just two people talking for a few minutes about something real. Jared brought the whole thing up again over coffee not that long ago. He said it was one of the more quietly interesting social dynamics he'd watched play out in person. Not dramatic, not a blow-up, just a slow process with a non-obvious cause and a gradual resolution. I asked what specifically kept coming back to him about it. He said the gap between intention and outcome. She thought she was being precise. She thought she was targeting specific behavior. But you can't write a public statement and then apply it selectively inside your head. The public statement goes out to everyone who reads it, and each person who reads it has to decide for themselves whether it applies to them. And most people, especially people who've already had the experience of being treated like a problem before they've done anything, are going to choose caution. They're going to pull back. They're going to do less. I said that's essentially what I told her. He asked how she took it. I said she was quiet for a minute, and then said she hadn't thought about it from that angle. He nodded and said that's actually the correct response. Said a lot of people get defensive when they realize something they did had an effect they didn't intend. They make it about the other person for noticing. He said she didn't do that. I said no, she didn't. He said the other thing that stuck with him was the follow-up post, the emotional unavailability one. I said, what about it? He said she wrote an entire analysis of why men in her life had become distant, found these cultural and structural explanations, talked about socialization and emotional armor and all of it. And the actual most immediate cause was sitting right there in something she'd posted 2 weeks before. I said, yeah, he said. And then when someone pointed that out in the comments, she deleted it. I said, I know. He was quiet for a second. Then he said he understood why. Said it's hard to see yourself as the cause of something you're experiencing as a problem, especially when you can find other explanations that feel true. I said, yeah, both things can be true at the same time. Some of it is cultural, and some of it was just the post. We finished coffee and went on with the rest of the day. I don't have a tidy conclusion to wrap around all of this. Nothing exploded, nobody left, nobody got badly hurt. It was just a few months where something unexpected happened, then a conversation, then a slow return to normal. The whole arc of it was probably less dramatic than I've made it sound just by telling it in detail. If anything sits with me from it, it's something pretty simple. When you put a rule into the world reads it literally. It doesn't have access to your history with the people you were frustrated with when you wrote it. It doesn't know the tone you intended or the specific behavior you were targeting. It just sees the rule and decides whether to comply. And people who've already had the experience of being treated like they're the problem before they've done anything are going to default to compliance. They're going to take the option that costs the least, which is to ask for nothing, volunteer nothing, and wait to be told what's acceptable. And then quiet is what you get. Not as punishment, not as a statement, just as the natural result of following clear instructions. She never reposted anything like that original list. I don't think she will. The stuff she posts now is different in a way that suggests something shifted somewhere along the way. Whether that was because of our conversation, or because of time, or because of something else entirely, I don't know, and it doesn't really matter. Jared still thinks it's one of the more quietly absurd things he's watched happen in real life. He's told the story to a couple of people. They always have some version of the same reaction. Yeah, what did she expect? I get that reaction, but I don't think it quite captures it. She expected something more specific than what she got. She expected the rules to be a filter, not a blanket. The gap between that expectation and what actually happened is the whole thing. Anyway, still going to the studio 3 mornings a week, still works for my back, still a good part of the routine. Things with Sloane are normal, easy, no residual weirdness. She's a good instructor. The class is good. That's the whole picture. Jared says he's thinking about trying the evening class on Thursdays because his schedule might be changing. I told him the morning sessions are better. He said he knows, but it's not always up to him. I said fair enough. MFW, a carefully worded post about conscious energy and intentional approaches, accidentally made an entire room of guys go full corporate professional mode for 2 months. And then she wrote a think piece about why men had become emotionally unavailable, and deleted the one comment that answered the question. Jared still laughs about that part. I do too, honestly. It's the kind of thing that's funny and not funny at the same time, which is pretty much how most real things are.